Good morning, bună dimineața, eu regel Kivano, dzień dobry, bonjour, guten morgen, good day everyone, and welcome to the RADPol 2020 Conference Webinar 3. My name is Kai Brand Jacobson. I'm the president of the Romanian Peace Institute, and I am providing the welcome and introduction today. The Radicalization in Central and Eastern Europe, Trends, Challenges, and Opportunities to Counteract Conference is a joint initiative of 3 European projects, Mind Before Act, Champions, and Brave, funded under the H2020 and ISF-P European Commission programs. The main organizer is the Polish Platform for Homeland Security, partner of the Mind Before Act project, while the Department of Education and Science of the Marshal Office of the Wielkopolska region in Poznan is a co-organizer of the conference. We would like to extend our warm welcome and appreciation to all participants joining us from across Europe and more widely internationally, as well as all of our speakers who are here today. The conference aims to foster a dialogue amongst practitioners and experts in the region and more widely on trends in various forms of radicalization in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the challenges they bring, on lessons learned and lessons identified from the ground, from frontline practitioners and the work of civil society groups, community organizations, law enforcement agencies, and others, and importantly, on how we can improve the links and effectiveness of collaboration between researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, and improve evidence-based policymaking and practice in our field. The goal of RADPol is to be practical, to be a place where experiences and good practices are exchanged, new innovations explored, and where the latest findings from both research and practice and the essence of multi-agency cooperation in this field can be brought forward. RADPol 2020 is the first of what we hope will become an annual event in the field, both online this year, and we hope in the future being able to welcome everyone coming together in person. Our session today will last from 10 until 12:25 on Central European time, 11 to 1:25 Eastern European time. We'll begin with the first panel 3 on multi-agency approach and joint action initiatives to tackling radicalization and violent extremism, looking at good practices, success stories, and lessons learned. We'll then have our expert panel 4 beginning at 11:20. That will be after a short virtual coffee break, looking at gender beyond not religiously motivated extremism. Without further ado, we'll dive into our first panel. Just to let all of our participants and audience who are here with us together today know, throughout the sessions, while our speakers are speaking, we will invite you also to input your ideas, your questions, and what you would like to share in the chat function. Presentations in this first panel will be about 7 to 10 minutes each. Afterwards, we'll be opening up for questions and answers and interaction, and then have closing remarks before the short coffee break and moving to the 4th session. I'm very glad to be able to welcome today 3 excellent speakers. We have György, who is chair of the Budapest Center for Mass Atrocities Prevention, Kucinska, expert at the Institute of Social Safety, and Cristina, head of the local, regional, and global security research unit at the Mihai Viteazul National Intelligence Academy in Bucharest. György, if the microphone are yours.
Thank you very much for the floor. Most welcome everybody who had time to participate in our webinar today. Most welcome to my colleagues in the panel, and right now I will share with you my screen. Hopefully you see it. Let me go to the very beginning. So this is a very important event, and I do think so, and I do hope that we shall be able to continue it not just during the time of our champions or other projects, but also later on, because I think that the exchange of views among practitioners is a very important and significant experience what we have to share with each other, and probably that might trigger further ideas, further initiatives, particularly in the field of multi-agency approach, where I think so we speak a lot about this approach, and I think that we need to even speak more about that, but we need to make the practice and we need to do it in a way that we try to develop and engage in a dialogue, a real dialogue process. So what we have done it for the last few months in the framework of the Champions, which is a great project. And this is not an easy task. So we have faced a lot of challenges. You might see here, there are challenges, but in specific challenges in countries where probably the features of autocracy are a bit strong. And also there are challenges without doubt in countries which we call so-called liberal democracies. Let me start with the challenges in autocracies, where I think so that the ruling parties' attitude to share the power, dialogue, and civil society is very weak. So these autocracies are characterized by the fact that they don't like to share the power, they don't like to conduct dialogue, they don't like civil society, they want to do everything on their own. So there is the political atmosphere in the countries is characterized mainly by fear, mistrust, there is a group enmity, there is a very strong polarization and hatred within the society, and it is at all levels. I mean, not just at the highest level among politicians, but also the lowest level at communities, in the communities. So the question is also in these countries, in these societies, how to overcome the traditional lack of dialogue. There is no established networks, platforms, and mechanisms of dialogue and interactions. It is neither horizontally, so among various sectors, nor vertically, so between the political level and the communities. These organizations, these societies are characterized mainly by homogenization. So the ruling parties try to homogenize societies, and then the people that weakens the public awareness and the current trends of radicalization. At the same time, in the liberal democracies, we do think so that there are experience and capacities in sustainable dialogue and interactions and community level, and definitely there are much more experience in that field. But in liberal democracies, the real dialogue, which is a so-called dialogue and intercultural dialogue, is not so frequently practiced. So therefore, I think that here there are also the liberal democracies a lot to do, and I wanted to encourage them also to do that as much as possible. So then that is the significance of the Champions, that we do it in practice. We have done it in Hungary together with the political capital, the other partner, Hungarian partner in the project of the Champions project, and together with them we have already done more than 10 roundtables, 10 meetings with frontline practitioners, and we anticipate another 10, 12 roundtables. We have reached the nice outcomes. So we found the venue for the roundtables. So the community with which or within which we try to trigger and generate the dialogue. And roundtables, that was the 8th district of Budapest. And then we have arrived as a process to concrete topics which we are going to explore further. This is the cohabitation of people and the segregation in education. Right now we design and launch the action plans. What are the lessons learned, what we have arrived for the time being? So there is, as I mentioned, there is a difference between the objectives of multi-agency approach in Western Europe and Central Europe. In Western Europe, there is much more about networking while in Central Europe, we would like, we need to set up this multi-agency approach from the crash. At the same time, there is a need of space for open and frank discussion and exchange of views of people. This is that was a discovery for us, because we found that from people coming from different sectors would like to find some space to talk to each other, to exchange their views, and that's what we need to continue. It is also important that it was not as easy as we envisaged in the beginning of the project to recruit people and to engage people, and mainly that was due to the fact that the frontline practitioners, particularly those who are willing to engage in such a dialogue processes, are really overloaded, and this is also due to the fact that there is a political divide within the country, as I said, at all levels. Just an example, that the representatives of the ruling parties simply don't participate in the process. The point of departure is the next point as a conclusion, that it differs basically from ours. Of course, they approach the problems from their daily perspectives, and they would like to, they prefer to settle their daily problems, while we as people coming with the idea to counter the radicalization and transform the theory into practice, this is a different approach, and we need to somehow to merge and to combine these two approaches. Recommendations, that's the final point. First of all, recommendations for the organizations, and these are recommendations based on our daily experience, and maybe after several months I would come to arrive at some other recommendations, but for the time being, what we recommend to the international organizations, first of all, please do provide funds for the follow-up. Our partners in the beginning have said and have requested us, please don't leave us after the completion of the project. So the sustainability, however, needs money, needs funding. So we need the help and assistance of the organizations. Secondly, provide support for exclusively dialogue processes. Please, we have made a lot of research on website and within our network. There are a lot of so-called dialogue processes, but the dialogue processes as intercultural level, ethnicity level, this is not so often happening in Europe. We need to make a distinction between the political context and challenges in East Europe or Central Europe and the challenges in other regions. In other regions, they speak in West Europe, when they speak about multi-agency approach, and this is MAA, they mean fight Islamism and terrorism. In our countries, there is much less, there is practically no fight against Islamism, no fight against terrorism. However, we do fight to counter the discrimination, the radicalization trends, the extremism, the right-wing extremism. For the scholars, please do develop your theory, and I also speak about myself, on the basis of daily practices. So we have to turn up, so we need to start to first of all to study what are the daily practices, and based on that we need to develop our theory, and not vice versa, that we do have our nice theories and then we say to the practitioners, please do it. I think so. I faced a lot of problems as a result of that approach. We need to raise the awareness, the public awareness, that factually that this multi-agency approach is a whole of sectors approach, and as such, that is a brother of the so-called whole of government approach, which tries to include all governmental sectors. And this is important to further develop. As to the implementers, I don't want to go into further details, but we need to bring the challenges, the so-called high-level political visions and challenges to the earth, and we have to thoroughly, as that should be the first step, thoroughly map and tailor our programs to the daily and local needs. So we can come up with nice ideas, but if we don't find the people and if we don't target the daily local needs, then we need to then we are just lost, and this is just a waste of time. And this is this requires a different approach according to the local needs. We need to reckon with the extra time because for the design and the preparation of the event, I don't want to exaggerate, but we invested much more time in preparing and designing our roundtables than we expected in the beginning of the whole exercise. We need to keep up the vigilance and interest of participants, which is that is not an easy type, not an easy task. And let's finish with my last point that and it is very important, that we need to avoid the language of scholars. We get used that we speak about polarization, radicalization, which is in our daily vocabulary. But please, in the daily vocabulary of the practitioners and of those people whom we have met and included in our process, this doesn't say too much. It is not sexy. They would rather speak about their daily problems, and we need to explore behind their problems the elements of radicalization. We have to point and to those elements, and we have to raise awareness of the practitioners that there behind that lies the element of radicalization. Sorry if I was a bit long. Thank you very much.
György, Cristina, thank you very much for your presentation, for your excellent points. Very much appreciated. I'm now very glad to welcome Anna Kucinska, an expert at the Institute of Social Safety. Just to let our audience with us today know, Anna and also Cristina Ivan at the Mihai Viteazul National Intelligence Academy, due to technical difficulties, are not able to share their cameras. We will be able to share their presentations. So, György, Cristina, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you
Anna
much.
will now be handing over to you.
Thank you, Kai. Can you hear me?
We
Yes?
hear you well, and we see
Okay.
the presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. First, I'd like to thank the organizers and all of you behind this conference for this great opportunity. And I'm really happy to be here. It's a pleasure, and it's really great to listen to presentations of other panelists. So it's a great learning opportunity too. So in my presentation, I'll focus on my personal and professional experience of participating in establishing Poland's first local level multi-agency team dedicated to preventing radicalization and violent extremism. So we started working with this group last year in November, December. So it's quite a fresh experience, and we're only we're on this road to fully functioning team. But I wouldn't call it a success story yet. It's just a great experiment, and I hope it will bring us the intended outcome. So this is just a caveat on my part. But before I talk about this wonderful, unique group of people, I'd like to say a few words about why multi-agency approach is important and definitely worth trying and multiplying. First, radicalization, as other social problems, is a very complex one. You have a lot of different factors in play. You have different stages of radicalization. People do it for different reasons. So it's always very complex, and as such an issue, it can only be addressed by a team of various experts and practitioners working together. So that's the first point. The second point is where they work together in such a multi-agency team, they pool and share their unique resources. So it's knowledge, information, competences, experience, but also funding, networks, contacts. So it's an effective synergy, and it's very important. And the people we work with, they always underline that it's a huge benefit, just learning from other people, sharing information they know, and sometimes they don't know what other people know, and sometimes they don't know what other people, what competences other people have. So it's really crucial. And the third point is that working together as a team and having successes and just enjoying the process gives such a tremendous sense of enthusiasm and commitment. So it's also this part of fun and just joy working together for a good cause that we know is important. And I think it's really, really rewarding, this element of team building, cooperation. And I think especially, as György mentioned, in Central and Eastern Europe, in our countries, in Poland, it's really extremely important to develop our collaboration skills and work together. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes, so this is the Poland's first local multi-agency team we established last year in Dabrowa Górnicza in Poland. Thanks to the Champions project funded by the European Commission. So it's thanks to this project and the project's framework that we're able to do what we're doing, and it's really essential. So the Dabrowa Górnicza, for those, it's a city of approximately 120,000 people, and it's located in the south of Poland. It's in the industrial part of Silesia. In the group, there are about 20 permanent members, and they are representatives of a variety of municipal departments, such as, for example, departments responsible for welfare policy, education, culture and sporting events, mental health issues. In this group, there are psychologists, teachers, people who organize cultural events, of course, the police, police officers, local police officers. So we have people who represent different aspects of the issue, and there are also local civil society organizations. So we have this civil society part 2. So far, we've had two workshops, 2 meetings, and we are organizing 2 more in summer. So in total, there are 6 more meetings with the group planned before we think the team is consolidated and can operate on its own. And in Dabrowa Górnicza, the main focus of the group is prevention of radicalization and education. So this is what we've established during the first meetings. Another very important point is that our group, our team, local team, is supported by the National Advisory Board, which we've also established as part of the Champions project, but also as part of Institute of Social Safety's activities. And this is a board of, again, different experts, researchers, academics, but also practitioners, teachers, psychologists, representatives of different important institutions that deal with radicalization, communication, and education. And together they contribute to building this knowledge of how to prevent radicalization in Poland. For example, they take part in the training that we provide for our group, They do some consultations. So they really provide this kind of support in terms of knowledge and information and practices. And yeah, they contribute what they can give given their areas of expertise. So 2 pictures of our group. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes, so this is our group, and they are really quite unique and special people. We're very lucky to be working with them, because I'll be talking about it later. They really have the courage and curiosity to explore these issues. Yeah, this is our first meeting. Can I have, yeah, this is our second workshop. Yeah, and I'll talk, yeah. I'll talk now about the challenges and how to make it work. And I think, as György mentioned, in Poland, it is too highly politicized issue, and it's very divisive in our society. So a remedy for this would be to have genuine support and understanding for the problem from decision makers. And we're really happy to have found the mayor of the city, Dabrowa Górnicza, who's really behind us. He fully understands and supports us in every activities, and he supports all the members of the team. So it's really a huge asset, and I think it is what makes it possible. Second, there's an issue can be an open-mindedness and a willingness to learn and to experiment, because we're trying different methodologies. We're really open to what's coming up. We don't have any rigid fixed ideas. We're just really experimenting and trying to improve the process. So you need to have that kind of mindset. And again, you need to have courage, personal and professional, to address issues such as radicalization, which are delicate, unpopular, and rather ignored. And again, what György said, it's relevant in Poland. We're dealing mainly with far-right extremism and radicalization. So it is sometimes used by different parties and politicians to it should be depoliticized. Again, another challenge is that the concept of radicalization, such as defined by Radicalization Awareness Network, is not recognized in Poland. So again, a remedy is to provide initial training to such teams, to really make them recognize that they may see some manifestations of radicalization in their work, and when they put all the elements together, they realize how complex and wide the issue is. Then again, it's the same in Poland as in Hungary. We really need to focus on trust building, and what really helps is to base our process on previous successful practices of multi-agency cooperation. So we have this in Dabrowa Górnicza because they are part of this nationwide, I think, welfare program. So in a way, they've paved the road for this project, and they do have a very high level of trust initially in the group. So it's a pleasure to work with them, and they also have a lot of trust between the municipality and civil society. So that really makes it very, very effective, pleasurable, and really very, very easy to work with them. But this is a very important issue to work on it, or to look for environments where there is trust or the ability to develop trust. Another challenge can be resistance or backlash from radicalized groups, which see that we're trying to deal with this issue. So they may like come up and try to disrupt the process. So we really need to be prepared for this, have some strategies to deal with it, and treat it as a possible risk, quite a potential risk. And then again, there's a question of limited time and funding. So it's a question of pooling funding or maybe embedding such teams in municipal structures to make it part of the regular work of people involved. So that could be a solution. And lessons learned, the final slide. So what we've learned from working with our group is that it's good to formalize it and thus make it sustainable. For example, appoint a team leader who's embedded in municipal structures, and he or she has decision-making powers. Or ideally, for example, it is a plenipotentiary for preventing radicalization, so dedicated to this issue. Another recommendation and lesson learned is to grant decision-making powers or ensure decision-making powers to the team. So whatever they are working on, it comes to fruition, it's implemented. So yeah, so it leads to effectiveness of their work. Another thing is shared ownership. So for example, in our case, we'd like to invest as much as we can in the local team in Dabrowa Górnicza, but also share the ownership and prepare all the members to work independently after the project completion, but also to gain the level of being experts themselves, experts in the field of radicalization. So this is our goal. And I think it produces a lot of enthusiasm, effectiveness, and sustainability again. Then again, to have this kind of enthusiasm, you need to meet regularly, build trust based on dialogue, as György underlined, and also meeting the needs of team members and institutions involved. So you need to have a lot to offer in the beginning to have people on board, and always be very sensitive to their needs and their work, because they are doing it as part of their work, so it has to be relevant. And final recommendation for policymakers, and it's to introduce a systemic solution on the national level, establish a national agency that would deal with the prevention and countering of radicalization. And it could be based on best EU practices and radicalization awareness network expertise, but also on bottom-up civil society initiatives and experts such as ours, what we do, the work we do, the experts we are, the experts we train. So then we can one day maybe be part of this national agency. And the third element is to, on the one hand, to build our expertise and networks, but also try to network and train government officials so they gain knowledge and they become ready for such a national initiative. So, yep, that will be it from my part. Thank you very much for listening. Yes, it was a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to any questions.
Anna, dziękuję. We will take the questions shortly when we move to the question and answer session. But I would just like to very briefly appreciate the richness of your presentation and György's before sharing these practical experiences and recommendations from your project. I particularly appreciated your mentioning the joy that comes about when bringing these actors together and their experience, the importance of trust and dialogue between different actors and sectors, of that political leadership support, and the necessity of processes to be practical, to actually meet the needs and address the issues that those involved are dealing with in their day-to-day work. Very glad to now have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Cristina Ivan, who I consider to be a leading expert and specialist in this field, together with all of our panelists today. Cristina, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today. I think it's a great opportunity and chance to connect to all the stakeholders and actors that are involved in the field of preventing radicalization and violent extremism. And to me, personally, I think it is a great opportunity, and I want to thank you for it. Secondly, I would like to say that what I'm going to say today, I will say it as my role, from my role as research team leader in the ARMOR project, and I will speak a little bit more about this ARMOR project today, and not in my capacity as a head of the National Institute for Intelligence Studies of the Academy. Therefore, what I'm going to express today are my own views and not the institutional views of the Academy or of the Romanian Intelligence Service. That being said, I think we can start the fun part. Okay, so my presentation today will focus on some of the lessons learned that we have managed to get in this project, but also on some of the reflections that I have been able to make. So the first question that I would like to address in this presentation is why multi-agency approaches and multi-stakeholder collaborations? Why that and not another kind of approach? And the answer, at least with our project, came from the fact that the push and the pull factors of radicalization involve an approach that is a sort of whole of society approach. The push factors are also always referring to conflicting identities, to issues related to uncertainty and revolt in the behavior of young people. They also refer to the disengagement for civic life, or to different narratives of us versus them polarizing societies and bringing a lack of self-esteem. Therefore, if we are to address these issues that are whole of society approaches, we also need to provide whole of society kind of approach in preventing radicalization and violent extremism. The pull factors, the one that attract young individuals towards becoming radical, are also referring to issues that can be addressed alternatively through other models in society, like a sense of belonging or the quest for meaningfulness or a sense of heroism. I'm not going to insist on that because I'm sure that we are all quite aware of them, and it's also something that it's only part of the topic of today's discussion. Now, in terms of how we can provide a kind of multi-agency approach or multi-stakeholder collaboration, I would only insist on the fact that these models of multi-agency approaches should be focused on two pillars. And this is something that we have come up through as a conclusion of our research, but also from the numerous years of dialogue with practitioners and experts in the field of preventing and countering radicalization. Obviously, in, I think, all Central and Eastern European countries, the countering of radicalization has not been that much of a challenge in the past decade, at least, because the numbers of people radicalizing has not been high. Therefore, countering only involves good approaches by the police, by the security and intelligence services. But what we have seen increasingly is their own need, and they become more and more vocal in passing this need on having a better cooperation with other institutions of the state, because it's, you know, putting people behind bars just because they radicalize and they start to become violent is one side of the problem, but it's definitely not the one approach that can actually protect the society and cannot provide protective factors for this whole of society approach. And therefore, what we have seen on the part of security experts and intelligence officers was an increasing demand on providing channels of communication and better cooperation with ministries of health, for instance, national administrations of the penitentiaries, ministries of integration. I would give here just one example. One of the challenges that we have faced in the past 3 to 4 years was to find the right channels to tackle with the issue of individuals that radicalize and that have mental health issues. This requires a very coherent approach from the state, and unless you have very good workflows and very good cooperation between different ministries of health, associations of psychologists, security and intelligence institutions, you tend to run into major problems. And when diagnosing these problems, you realize that in fact it's an issue of mistrust and a lack of common dialogue. Therefore, what we have tried to create through this ARMOR project and other initiatives at national and Central European levels was to try to come up with initiatives that would actually focus more on prevention and focus on two big pillars. One in which we can connect actors at policy level and connect ministries like Ministry of Education, Social Welfare, Integration, city councils and local police, but on the other hand, try to come up with methods to connect experts and practitioners at grassroots level. Psychological associations play a great role in preventing radicalization and violent extremism. Civil society organizations, think tanks, research entities, they have a tremendous role in putting the right message forward and making people really understand what are the underlying issues at the level of our societies and, you know, the embedded problems that we need to address. And obviously it's a community problem and we should treat it as such. Now, without further ado, I would like to just devote 2 minutes to speak about this concrete example of the Armor project and what we have done in this project. It's a project in which we have been trying to set up a set of experimental laboratories, like safe places where practitioners and experts can actually interact with each other and come up with innovative ways of tackling with the issue of social polarization, violent extremism, and radicalization to Islamist extremism. What we have tried to find was, our main aim was to come up with better approaches to resolving conflicts in principled ways, therefore fostering relationships and facilitating bonding between potential adverse individuals, and also teaching youth on how to control behavior by making choices which satisfy their needs. Now, if we go further, this is the kind of lab architecture that we set in place, and I'm only mentioning it because I will derive a set of lessons learned that I would like to communicate with you further. So in the Armor project, we have designed 3 sets of labs. A set of lab addresses individual capacity building, and through which we try to transfer to practitioners and experts in the 7 countries that are part of the project strategies that have been used in coaching and parenting, in critical thinking, and in anger management. Therefore, they can replicate the model and further disseminate good strategies that create individual agency at the level of vulnerable populations. Secondly, we tried to create community capacity building, and we did this through another set of laboratories in which we experimented with, calibrated and validated with the practitioners strategies that are derived from narrative therapy, from simulation and debate strategies, and conflict resolution. And last but not least, we dedicated a separate lab to tailoring the state response, and in it we brought together practitioners from the Ministry of Interior, from the Intelligence Service, from the prosecutor's office, but also civil society organization representatives and practitioners from the front line of dealing with social polarization and radicalization, just to be able to create a better understanding between them and help them together tailor proportionate responses. Because I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to not give an oversized reaction to an instance of radicalization within a community, or on the contrary, not to give any response on the part of, not to have any response on the part of the institution and just let things happen. Therefore, we try to create with them a sort of balance and proportionate response. Right, so that was the architecture of the labs. The labs were carried out in Romania in early January and February, but they are also ongoing, and unfortunately because of the COVID pandemic, they had to be stopped. They are still ongoing in Malta, Italy, Spain, Greece, and the Netherlands. At the end, we will calibrate all the findings that we come up with from the different practitioners in the field, and we will try to embed them, integrate them in a train-the-trainer program, which will follow in the next year of the program. So that's about the project. Now, very quickly, in terms of recommendations for improving policy and practice, I would take two looks. One is microgranular, because it refers to the project, and I will try to see how to make it work from the lessons and recommendations that are given in our experience in the project. And I would say that, and this is, I think, something that is relevant to all the civil society organizations that are working in the field as well. It's very important in your training, in your transferring of skills, to use cognitive behavioral instructional model, hands-on things. People don't like to listen to theories, as my former speaker mentioned at the beginning of this panel. They want, practical advice. They want to know what they can do on a daily basis, so that they can see added value from the beginning, from taking these policies further. And therefore, we focused with very good results on instruction and demonstration, role play, feedback, social reinforcement, and further extended practice. So one lesson learned is that we need to create a sort of safe space where practitioners and experts can learn how to replicate this kind of behaviors towards the outer public. Now, in terms of the challenges and difficulties that we have managed to identify and map out with this project, but not only, as I said, we have at the Institute quite a long number of years of experience. One of the most common statements, the negative statements that I heard were, both on the part of civil society practitioners, but also on the part of the state institutions practitioners, we don't communicate enough. Or even worse, they don't listen to us. They don't understand the problem. And this is something that we need to address. Another common statement is, we are not going to turn our kids to the police, obviously, with a huge lack of trust in state institutions. Or, I have noticed something is wrong, but I don't know what it means, and I'm not sure what to do. Another one is, what will happen to this person if I call a green line and report a problem? It's obviously mapping out an unknown territory. Or, it's not up to me to solve this problem. Or, I want to help, but we don't know how. So what we have noticed as challenges and difficulties that we need to overcome, and I think this is a common problem in both Central and Southeastern Europe, is a lack of communication between the different layers of practitioners and experts involved in preventing and countering radicalization. Also, a lack of trust between the different stakeholders, and here I could also mention different state institutions involved in the problem. It's also a lack of know-how on the part of the frontliners. And then I would also state a set of problems that I believe are even more important, because the ones that I have just mentioned can and have been solved through different European projects. But then there is also to keep in mind the fact that we have non-transparent policies and workflows. We have a lack of framework to foster interagency cooperation, and I think this is a shared problem from the focus groups that we have made with different practitioners. This recurrently came up in the ARMOR project. We don't have a framework, we don't have transparent workflows. Maybe it's too much bureaucracy. I would not be able to say that for all countries, but it's definitely a valid topic for at least some of our countries. A lack of clear laws sometimes. Like, for instance, the example I just gave with the individuals that radicalize and that have mental health issues. There is a major issue in managing them, in managing their problems, because there are contradicting frameworks, legal frameworks, and practitioners don't know how to cooperate for their benefit. So, with reference to recommendations, I would say first we need to teach practitioners how to respond in concrete situations and equip them with a first aid emergency toolkit. This is something that all our projects that we have been speaking of today are doing, which is good. Provide them with a better understanding of risk factors. Then again, it's part of the training, the education, we do it. Give them a voice and make decision makers listen to the messages transmitted from across the spectrum of practitioners and individuals involved in preventing social polarization and violent extremism. This is also something that partially has been done. The European Commission is doing tremendous work on that. The RAN network is also doing a lot. We are trying to do that through different projects. So at this point, I think in all our Central and Eastern European countries, we are in a point in which we have created the networks of practitioners and we have built trust. But we are in a point in which we still need to work a lot to implement clear policies, workflows and tasks, to create valid task forces, to set clear responsibilities and to engage everyone. This is not yet a chartered territory for us. It's something that we still need to work on. So, sorry. Here I was, okay. The multi-agency approach obviously had this objective at the forefront, to build mutual trust between experts. Have we done it? Probably we are in the process of doing that. We have a common language, we have a shared culture and values that we are trying to transfer and replicate. We have even designed training programs. So we are improving communication and sharing lessons across institutions and sectors, and probably also improving common trust. What we need to do further is to understand and foster initiatives that implement cooperation platforms and joint task forces. And I think the European Commission is doing that at the moment. At state level, we need to create transsectorial programs and clear workflows. And I could not emphasize that enough. I think it's the main problem that we have at the moment. And at local level, we need to encourage tailoring and continuous recalibration of initiatives. This is something that we still need to work. We have a lot of work to do in front of us. And unless there is a clear political will and a lot of enthusiasm on all our part, I think we might run the risk of not being able to do that in time. And with that, I think I have finished my presentation. Hello, can you still hear me? You know, not being able to see you, sometimes I have the feeling.
Cristina.
Okay.
We did hear you. We heard you quite well. Thank you for your presentation, the practical examples and sharing, and in particular also for the recommendations that you shared at the end. We're now moving to our question and answer session, and I would like to once again invite everyone who's joining us in the audience today, if you have questions, if you have anything you'd like to share, the method we are using is to type it into the chat box. You should, on your GoToWebinar control panel, have an option for the chat. If you type in your message there, then it will be asked to the panelists. We're going to extend this session just a few minutes until 10 after rather than 5 after. So we have the opportunity to ask a few questions of our panelists. I'd invite the panelists to give full, rich answers, but as concise as possible so we can have a few questions. The first one was specifically to you, György, on how do we know whether we are talking about the same phenomena and problems between scholars and frontline practitioners or first-line practitioners if we don't use consistent vocabulary and concepts such as radicalization? What would you suggest as an approach to this?
Look, I think that this how to combine and how to merge, how to harmonize, let's say, so the two languages, I think this is a matter of practice. So I don't believe that we shall be able to find out without the daily practice to create a common language. What we understood here during this this whole process, that if you there is a need, as all the others said, there is a need of a pragmatic approach. People who enter into such a dialogue process, they will want to have results in the end, and this whole process should be started to raise the awareness and of the problems of the radicalization, as we have started in the beginning. And then when coming to the daily problems, then you have to point to the fact that, look, you speak right now, for example, about the lack of benches in a street where people can sit. And this is already a huge problem for the district, and that might radicalize the people, because if there is a Roma guy sitting on the bench, or a homeless, and they say that they occupy it and so on. But then you have to point to the fact that this is a reason, you know, that if you are able to settle the problem with the benches, then you are able to settle or eliminate one of the problems, or one of the reasons, underlying reasons of radicalization. And that comes just through daily practice and through the lessons learned, and as I said, through sharing these best practices together, not just among practitioners, but share best practices and assess best practices also among the theorists or with the theorists.
Thank you.
Does it make sense?
Thank you. That was perfect. We have another question to all panelists, and my recommendation, I would invite whoever wishes to answer, but if you feel that the answer has already been given, just let us know, and that way we can move forward more fluidly through it. So the question to all three panelists: in your opinion, which actor is best suited to lead and coordinate multi-stakeholder responses to radicalization? Anna, Cristina, György, anyone who wishes to take that?
NGOs, in my view, because NGOs could play the role of an impartial partner. You have to be, and you have to prove to be, an impartial and unbiased partner. Otherwise, they would blame you. You are belonging to some parties or to some, and then that's what you have to avoid.
So we have the answer NGOs from György. Anna, how would you answer that?
I would agree. I was thinking also about different local cases. So, for example, we need to also rely on local strengths and different actors. For example, in our case, that would be the mayor of the city, but also a very active education sector and very active crisis management sector. So I would maybe agree with György, but also say factor in local context and local strengths.
And Cristina, what would be your response?
Well, not surprisingly, I would agree a bit in the sense that, yes, local initiatives and practical initiatives should indeed be coordinated by NGOs, because they have the stamina, the enthusiasm, the pragmatism needed to solve it. Being on the other side of the barricade for so many years, I have also seen that without a political will and without funding from the state, you cannot do much. And you cannot replicate best practices that you identify in one local level towards other parts of the country where they are needed. And therefore, I would here just mention a couple of the models that work well and that involve the state, like the Finnish model, the Scandinavian model in general, in which you have this task force being set up at the level of the state with all parties involved, and they work together. And there is a sort of, let's say, coordination from the Ministry of Interior or the authority that deals with with terrorism. But that kind of coordination is in a way symbolic, in the sense that it ensures legality, whereas all parties have an equal role and an equal voice. And this is the kind of model that I would aspire to, just to make sure that we have also the channels to involve decision makers in a coherent manner and ensure the funding.
Kai, let me add one sentence to that. That this also, the Finnish example, shows the big difference between Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Central Europe, where the states, the governments provide funds for such exercises. In our countries in Central Europe, you are in a very, very difficult situation to get funds from the central authorities. And this is a basic problem and a basic difference which we have to overcome.
But György, this is an interesting point, because when you look at the Finnish and other models, when they began, they did not have that. They began as pioneering initiatives by different stakeholders and actors who brought it forward. When the case was made and it was proven that it was effective, cost effective and improved response, then you had take up by state. So it was providing evidence. I think we had answers emphasizing the need for localizing to the context, but also the importance of neutrality and trusted role of the facilitator. The interesting element brought forward in your response, Cristina, there are different examples and models we can learn from across Europe. Perhaps what has not been done enough, and this panel has tried to contribute to answering this a bit, is to learn together from these examples, to bring together clearly and make available for practitioners and policymakers different cases of trying to implement multi-stakeholder collaboration and what can be learned from them. We have another question that has come forward here. How have the main narratives of radicalization, anti-migration, Islamophobic, homophobic, Islamic radicalization manifested in football? Very specific question. By fans, clubs, governing bodies. Can anyone speak to that? The original question was directed specifically to Hungary, but I would ask if there's also relevant experience from Poland and Romania.
Well,
so
in
how
Hungary,
has it manifested in football and sports?
In Hungary, unfortunately, in football, it manifests. So there are a lot of experience when the I would speak the nationalism manifested mainly. Very rarely the xenophobia. Although in the Hungarian Football League, there play a lot of foreign players coming even from some so-called third world countries, and people might really have the chance to say, look, he's a foreigner, and then we don't like foreigners, but they appreciate it. And although not many people really visits football matches, unfortunately, in Hungary, but they don't play this card out too much in Hungary in the case of football.
Thank you. And Anna or Cristina?
I'm afraid I don't have knowledge on that. I can't answer.
All right. Anna?
I could only say very quickly, I'm not an expert on football. My colleague Jacek Purski is, but I could say there are definitely close links between the process of radicalization and so-called pseudo football fans or just hooligans. So we need to make that clear distinction. And in Poland, I think from what we've learned so far is that it is often a ground for just recruiting and radicalizing people. So we have to pay attention to that. But other initiatives, for example, from Germany, show that it can also be, on the one hand, it's a challenge and a risk. On the other hand, it can be a great opportunity to work with football fans and to promote, I don't know, diversity and the values we want to promote, and see to make people less vulnerable to radicalization.
Anna, thank you so much. We're now at the time for our first panel today. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, György Tatár, of the chair of the Budapest Center for Mass Atrocities Prevention, Anna Kucinska, expert at the Institute of Social Safety, and Cristina Ivan from the Mihai Viteazul National Intelligence Academy. Before we move to the coffee break, I would just like to also share with all of our audience today, there will be a further conference in January 2021, another example of the three consortia who are involved in this conference coming together to organize an EU-wide event. We would also like to directly outreach to all other projects and initiatives supported by the European Commission, but also others dealing with radicalization and violent extremism, if you would like to join and be partners in this event so that we can collaborate together. I'd also like to highlight the firstlinepractitioners.eu web platform. A number of times people were speaking about the need to share lessons, share experiences. This is an effort which now many European Commission projects are putting their materials on this platform instead of the traditional always having a separate website for every separate project, so that there can be a one-stop multilingual shop for practitioners, policymakers, experts, and academics across Europe to find tools they need there. And it is also putting in place tools for collaboration. To highlight also some of the key points made by our speakers today, the importance of putting practical mechanisms in place for multi-stakeholder collaboration, the need that the processes themselves be practical, addressing the issues. Also, the importance of training. One of the things we've seen is actors are trained by their own sectors, their own languages, their own ways of seeing these issues, improving joined up training so that they learn and practice, and having those cognitive behavior, the practice-based training. The other element, not spoken of that much yet today, but the importance of joint learning and evaluation, putting in place the systems and tools to be more rigorously learning what works, what doesn't work, and helping to feed that forward into improved policy and practice. We hope you have enjoyed and benefited from the panel today. We'd like to thank everyone for taking part. We're now going to have a virtual coffee break before we come back for the final session of RADPol 2020 Expert Panel 4 on gender beyond not religiously motivated extremism. We'd like to invite all of our audience to come back and join us again for that. But in the meantime, grab some fresh air, tea, cup of coffee. Thank you for this morning, and wherever you join us from, wishing you well in all you're doing.
Bye-bye.
Good morning to everybody. My name is Carola Garcia Calvo. I'm Senior Analyst at the Program of Violent Radicalization and Global Terrorism at the Spanish think tank Elcano Royal Institute, as well as my BFORAC H2020 Project Scientific Coordinator. It's my pleasure being the moderator of this highly interesting panel on gender beyond not religiously motivated extremism that closes this series of webinars organized by 3 European projects, namely BRAVE, Champions, and of course, MindBeForAct. Throughout the MindBeForAct project, a particular focus has been given to the gender perspective, which is included as a cross-cutting axis in all the activities developed over its 3-year length period. Because we do believe in the relevance of applying a gender lens to PCB initiatives in order to make them both effective and sustainable. So first, because research has proved that pull and push factors for adopting an extremist view are experienced quite differently by men and women. So terrorist groups exploit these differences in their narratives and recruitment strategies. But also, of course, because we know about the potential role that women can play in preventing violent extremism. So today we will have the opportunity to discuss such a timely topic with 3 great speakers who will address the issue from 3 different perspectives as well. So in the first place, Mrs. Cristina Risa, who is research analyst at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change in London, is going to introduce us the topic of gender in the context of the far-right ideology, including the path for radicalization and current roles of women in the right-far groups, as well as new forms of gender extremism as the incels. Then Dr. Rafael Kropunin, Research Director of Women Without Borders, will present us the Mother Schools model, which is a good practice developed by Women Without Borders, which is also partnered in MindBeForAct project for preventing jihadism, but it's also could be also useful for others non-religious extremisms, as for instance the far-right groups. And last and not least, I will give the floor to Dr. Harald Weinbock, Head of Research of Cultures Initiative, which is part of the German National PV program, who will present us the topic of gender advocacy in preventing intolerance and group hate in Central and Eastern Europe and beyond as part of the CEE Prevent Net project in which is currently involved. So after the presentations, we'll reopen a Q&A session. So I hereby encourage our audience to submit their questions, the question chat that you will find on your right hand, probably in my computer appears on my right side. So please don't be shy at the moment of sending our questions to our speakers from this moment. Thank you so much in advance for this. So before this brief introduction, I think that this now is time now for the speakers. So I will give the floor to our first speaker, Mrs. Cristina Risa. So Cristina, the floor is yours, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carola, for that introduction and for inviting me to present. I'm going to see if I can share my screen, which yes, I think I can. Perfect. So thank you for inviting me. Today, I will speak about gender and the far right. And the way that I've organized this presentation, I want to start by giving a brief overview about why gender and when do the far right talk about gender. And then I'll go a bit more into what this means for men and what this means for women. And I'll end with a bit of discussion on successful counter narratives and policy recommendations. So what's important when we think about the far right and about what kind of issues they might care about or they might mobilize around, maybe gender would not come to mind. However, gender has been a very, very useful instrument for far-right groups to promote their rhetoric. And this has taken many forms. It could look like a men-only misogynistic group that is obviously grounded in a certain notion of what gender means and is targeting women as part of their strategy and violent actions. It could mean groups trying to have women as leaders to portray the movement as sort of a palatable alternative that is a bit more soft-spoken. Or it could look, as you can see in this meme by a British far-right group, as just an excuse to promote anti-Muslim sentiment. So the way that these groups are using gender is basically victimizing women and promoting the idea that there is a conspiracy to bring Islam into Europe and Islamized society, and this is why you can basically see it in this meme here. So obviously the reason why this is taking many forms is that the far right is not a united movement. The far right is a loose network of many different strands and ideologies that sometimes do overlap, but some other times really are quite contradictory. So we do have many different interpretations of gender and what that means for the far right. Yet there are some general tenets that are quite shared between the far right. The main one is that basically the far right subscribes to a traditional and patriarchal view on the role of women and men in society, and they basically promote kind of an enhanced idea of femininity and masculinity along this. So it's interesting to reflect a bit on why do they do this. Over recent years and decades, we've seen movements trying to call for more equality, to create a just and fair society. So we've seen feminism, we've seen movements protecting LGBT, we've seen hate crime provisions being written into legislation so we could protect racial and religious minorities from abuse. So as much as these movements obviously are seen as a way to create a more equal society and are therefore viewed as good values, the far right does not see them as a positive. The far right basically understands these movements as an imposition of hard left ideology, or how they would term it, cultural Marxism. So this is very much exemplified through Anders Breivik's thinking, who is as you might know, he committed one of the worst terrorist attacks inspired by this ideology in 2011, killing 77 people in Norway. And Breivik thought that this cultural Marxism, left-wing ideology, had infiltrated Europe to the point that now there were only two groups: the people who were considered by society as good people, who had better rights and were protected by the government, and this included feminists and LGBT and Muslims and other minorities, and then the people who were considered by society to be evil and whose rights were therefore not as protected, like white Christian men, non-feminist women, and anyone else who would descend to what he called political correctness. So this is going from this, we can see why the far right would try to promote quite a strong sense of masculinity and femininity, because they want that to go against what they think society looks like at the moment. So for men, basically, what obviously in the far right, we've seen more men than women in general. Men are usually fronting the movements, and they're also more involved in terrorist plots and attacks. But although we do have women as well, but this is basically a men-dominated movement. And so we do have quite a strong sense of masculinity being promoted by these groups. We often would find probably two categories. If we think about more neo-Nazi groups, we would see men being portrayed as, you know, strong, sort of emulating military aesthetic with tattoos, maybe a swastika on the forehead, that kind of image. Yet there is a new concept of masculinity that is being promoted with these groups, and that is maybe not in this kind of neo-Nazi, very openly pro-Hitler groups, but some others that are trying to appear a bit more mainstream and a bit more modern. So you see them, for example, dressed in trendy clothes, in polo shirts, with glasses. Sometimes they've been referred to as hipster fascists, even because of the way that they look. And I think we shouldn't forget that aesthetic is a really, really important thing with the far right, and this applies to masculinity and recruitment as well. For example, if you take a look at the picture on the top, this is from a group based in New Zealand that was very recently, earlier this year, linked to a foil terror plot. And this is a capture of a video that they uploaded, which showed members and prospective members climbing a mountain together. And the reason why they climbed a mountain, because that would basically show that they're strong men able to conquer the mountain, and therefore able and sort of would be accepted within the far right. So they're basically kind of encouraged to look a certain way, to work out, to take care about their image, to what they call self-improve. As well, another group that we have, another subsection maybe within the far right, is the manosphere. And the manosphere is entirely framed around gender, because these are men-only groups that are clearly misogynistic. So we've had, in the bottom image, we have an image of Proud Boys, US-based manosphere group, which basically is based upon misogynistic principles and have engaged in their members have been connected to acts of violence on the basis of this. I want to just stop here for a second and talk about incels. There's been a lot of debate about incels in lately, particularly because there was an attack earlier this February in Canada that at the point authorities did not consider it to be a terrorist attack, but then later on it emerged that it was inspired by incel ideology. So what is incel ideology? Incel refers to involuntary celibates, which are a community of men online who basically consider themselves to be undesirable by women, and therefore they're not able to have sexual relationships with them, and they're obviously frustrated about that fact, and they've justified violence on that basis. Incels basically see the world in categories, and this applies to men and women. So the way that they see men, they portray themselves, you know, as you can see on the left-hand meme, you know, slouch with a bad posture, not very attractive. No one would take a second look at this kind of thing. That's how they portray themselves. Whereas they see rest of the men in society as very strong, masculine, the kind of men that women would be attracted to and therefore would want to have sexual relationships with. So as you can see here, this is a bit of a paradox, because the man that they see in the right-hand side, which they see as enemies, by the way, is what would probably define a lot of the aesthetic from other far-right groups. As well, they do the same with women. They have the Stacy prototype and the Becky, and the Stacy is basically referring to those women that they consider to be the most attractive in society, and the Becky are the women who are sort of more average looking, but still they hate them both because none of them agree to have a sexual relationship with them. Now, if we go to the case of women, we've seen how traditionally, much as in the jihadist scenario, women are traditionally mothers and wives and have this sort of supportive role in far-right movements. But however, they've become a lot more involved over recent years. Even before, we've had a women-only KKK group. We've had women involved in several terror murders and plots in Germany over the span of 10 years. In the bottom left-hand side, sorry, we've had women involved in fronting movements. So there's a lot of visibility that comes with it. But often women in the far right, one of the things that they really rally about is this anti-feminism sentiment, and for that they also portray a very ultra-femininity. They portray this ultra femininity image, with them often, you know, appearing very polished, very well dressed, almost as an Instagram influencer, if you will. And it's important to note in here that as much as I mentioned before that this masculinity could be a recruitment hook for men in the far right, women looking very feminine and women in the far right often are a hook to recruit new members, and also they're quite popular with obviously the male recruits. There was a testimony from a woman who used to be involved in a neo-Nazi group in Canada, who basically said that when you join one of these movements, you're the center of attention because everyone wants to date you. So there's kind of that notion kind of goes with it for recruitment as well. I want to just end my presentation by reflecting on some of the successful initiatives that we've had in the past, trying to incorporate this gender dimension. Obviously, my colleague in the panel will speak more about his respective area, but just wanted to highlight some of the examples. It is true that we don't have as many examples trying to incorporate and programs incorporate gender into preventing and countering the far right. All of these programs usually, well, all of them took place in Germany. Some of them were pilot projects, some of them have carried on, but are just good examples on the importance of introducing this gender perspective. I want to just end today by reflecting on three very quick points. The first one in terms of what we need when it comes to gender at the far right. So first thing that we need is better data. We don't have enough data as it stands about how do people radicalize in the far right, how do they get recruited. And sometimes the data that we have from some groups do not apply to more recent groups. So there's a real gap in our understanding and the information that we have available. And obviously having sort of a gender breakdown in this data would be hugely useful. The second one, as a lot of the programs before echoed, it's important to incorporate this gendered approach to preventative and also de-radicalization strategies. And this basically means as these kind of gender narratives do influence quite a lot how these groups structure themselves and recruit, we should be seeing that kind of the counterpart in the counter narratives as well, where we have women and men involved depending on the circumstances. Another thing that and lately, I just want to end with a bit of note of caution in that in our response, we need to be careful about not perpetuating gender stereotypes. For example, we might not realize that in the case of the incels, as I said before, they've been connected to violence threats, and they're increasingly posing a terrorism threat. But they're also a public health threat in the sense that the community not only encourages violence against others, but they glorify suicide and self-harm. So we've had a lot of cases with incels sort of promoting that, and that goes beyond just a terrorist threat. And as well, if we think about women in the far right, there are many cases where, apart from them being involved and recruited into the movement, there's also a lot of domestic violence going on. So when they're trying to leave the movements, kind of that comes into play, especially if they have children who are being sort of groomed into the movement as well. So I'm going to leave it here. Very happy to answer any questions about the presentation that you may have. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Cristina, for your brilliant presentation. And thank you especially for focus on these gender stereotypes, because of course, it's important to avoid this kind of stereotypes when approaching to women as just passive and peaceful actors in the movements. As you mentioned in your presentation, women are gaining roles not only in the far right but also in religious inspired extremism, and they are adopting crucial roles for the development of these violent groups. So just avoid this kind of stereotypes, because they are very active and ideological actors within this extremist group. So thank you so much for pointing out this point among the others you share with the audience today. So now it's the turn for Dr. Kropyunin. Raphael, the floor is yours. Thank you so much. I think that yes, we can hear you now.
Yes, I need to move to the side. Okay. Well, it's so great to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you also for talking about this very important issue just now about the role of gender and right-wing extremism. In our model, we're also looking to increasingly address other forms of extremism. So this is very welcome. Thank you. And of course, just as a note, it would have been nice to meet all of you in person, but given the uncertain times, obviously, this will have to wait. But it's also pointed to a lot of inequalities and injustices, racially and gender-wise, that we've been alerted to. And I think this is also something that is important to note, because in all the work that we do, the gender component and the individuals we work with are already isolated, and they are some of the individuals who are most impacted by the current crisis, which makes it increasingly important to keep our ear to the ground so we can respond and adapt to local needs, as also György and Cristina said in the last panel. So tailoring to those local needs. What we do at Women Without Borders is bridging the grassroots and that policy divide. So it's very important for us, and I think something you will hear me talk about now in a little bit more detail. I'd like to briefly explain the model today, the Women Without Borders Mother Schools Parenting for Peace model that we have been implementing in 16 countries to date, across in Europe, in the Western Balkans, in Germany, Austria, Belgium, and the UK. So the talk today, my talk today is about the role of families in community level prevention work, and why exactly also Women Without Borders have devoted close to a decade of building up a dynamic and very adaptable family-centered security architecture. We call this, as I mentioned, Parenting for Peace, the Mother Schools model on the one hand, and more recently, based on a similar study that we conducted for the Mother Schools to inform as an evidence base, to inform the program and the curriculum, now the Father Schools model. And we've been piloting this for the past year. So these together now, we saw that the absence of men as well in a lot of the community approaches around gender was something that needed to be addressed. And we found that men often are willing to take on this role of parenting, but are often very insecure about their identity. So we've tailored a program around the findings of our study. Around the world, we also see that it's important to work with parents because they are usually the first teachers in the lives of their children. And while I'm not a parent, I think that a lot of you might agree with that. And I'm also reminded of a counterterrorism engagement officer in Denmark who recently said, and I quote, "We must try to give the responsibility back to the parents in an organized way. We cannot be the second parents." And this is the mantra of our program as well, that peace starts at home, that families can be a deciding factor, rendering youths either resistant or susceptible to these radical influences. Mothers in particular, in our work, have proved to be a stop factor to the radicalization of youths. And this is something that's mirrored by our local implementing partners time and time again. A Belgian partner said that in all situations he's come across, mothers were the last piece holding young people from traveling to Daesh. By the same token, parenting is also often taken for granted. It's not something like you go to school and you receive biology lessons or history lessons. It's something that often is taken for granted in that we think it's innate. But we've seen that many parents lack the necessary self-confidence and knowledge to reach their full potential in whatever capacity that might be in parenting. So what we do through the Mother Schools model is to train cohorts of concerned or affected parents to really become role models for change, and to build resilient communities to safeguard the next generation and work towards, in our case, reclaiming the extremists' space. The schools are, sometimes people assume that they're physical places, but they're actually a series of workshops, and these are usually held at community centers, municipalities, sometimes in the homes of mothers themselves, depending on whether they're allowed to leave or depending on the context or where they're most comfortable. It's to create a safe space that they can also use beyond the end of the project. So that's very key for us to keep in mind always. And the schools meet for 10 weeks, always, the sessions, 4 hours at a time. And in total, a mother receives 40 hours of training before we have an official graduation ceremony where all the local stakeholders, also individuals on the policy level, are invited to bridge that gap. And often we see there that the participants talk about taboo topics in the communities for the first time and break that silence. So it starts a dialogue. And we always say that the Mother Schools are not, the Mother Schools are a beginning. They don't end with the program itself. So I want to continue with, to talk about how the program is structured. It goes through, in the 10 sessions, it goes from the self, so building up the self-confidence. The participants build up group trust, employing exercises, theory, and storytelling. And then they open up about personal topics that they often haven't shared with anyone. So it creates a safe space and the sense of breaking up the isolation as well that some feel. Then they learn about the early warning signs. They learn about how to better communicate with their children. So the developmental phases of child psychology. We use the Erik Erikson approach for that. And in the end, it's about their role in the community itself and in the family, how they can make a change. And here we've seen, I want to draw on a few examples that we've come across recently to show some of the impact it has as well in real time, and how mothers are able to strategize, to come together and execute individual and group action together to uproot toxic influences and hotspots. So to highlight this, I want to talk briefly about what we have experienced in North Macedonia through monitoring and evaluation. We've been implementing the program there since 2016, and there we've recently observed the reappearance of radical ideologies in some of the FTF communities of origin. It's important to mention as well that this development has been unfolding in their absence. So by continuing our intervention work there at the community level, we've seen how participants in 2 locations in North Macedonia, Gosteva and Studenicani, identified what appeared to be recruitment centers run by foreign NGOs. So within a few weeks of the program, at the start of the mother school groups, we saw how the teachers and the participants began to coordinate with the local headmasters and local municipalities, and they were able to convince parents to take their daughters out of these and their sons out of dormitories where children, according to them, were being exposed to violent video games and toxic ideologies. So this was a very quick turnaround, and it makes clear that these developments can go undetected in the absence of security stakeholders on the ground who are really invested and who don't clock the hours and who have the necessary training. As in the case of North Macedonia, I want to briefly point out as well that Belgium is another place where we've seen some worrisome developments. In a phone conversation before the lockdown with our Belgian partner, we talked about how the factors that led to a lot of people being radicalized are still very much present. And in his words, he says that polarization he sees is even bigger now than it was. He also sees that the communities where we've worked, including Molenbeek, Vilvoorde, Antwerp, in particular, are experiencing a shift towards ultra-conservatism, as in the case of North Macedonia, for instance, in other Western Balkan countries where we're operating or researching. But as we all know, there's also a new ingredient that's come to our attention, and that's right-wing inspired acts of violence. And this we see is clearly, or increasingly is becoming clear through our work, that it's directly linked also to the public discourse around the quote-unquote returnee question. Another Vilvoorde group note taker of the Mother Schools chapter made this very apparent when she told me about how in early 2019 things really began to change for her community as well, because she saw that there's a lot of hate now because of what is happening with the returnees. She said that by the summer, someone pulled her out of her car near the grocery store and told her, quote, "Go back to your country and make bombs." She's a former note taker who also lost friends to Syria. Her city was also among the most notorious European recruitment hubs. And her, as a young Muslim woman living in a deeply polarized climate in the heart of Europe, was attacked in broad daylight. But that's no longer an anomaly. She says now, because of the people coming back and running away from Syria, Belgians are mad at the Muslims, but they're afraid of the men. They instead are attacking older people, children, and the physically weaker, and women. So this has, she sees, also enraged brothers and fathers within the community and perpetuated this cycle of violence that is starting. This is a sentiment that's closely mirrored by one of our former Vilvoorde teachers. She also found that in our Moroccan communities, people don't want to talk about it anymore, and Belgian people don't want individuals to return. She had a very similar experience, and time again, also took away a lot of mental health issues for it. She said when she talked to a lot of people, a common reaction, and she experienced this many times, people would say to her along the lines of, "Your kids, your boys went to Syria." And she says, "I had no kids who went to Syria," but she's often treated, demonized as and mother of ISIS members. So we find, and she finds that the problem is rooted in the fact that both sides don't have any direct contact and communication with one another. To her and to us, an obvious solution would be to develop a type of mother schools program. This goes back to the question of adaptability that brings family members from both societies together, both sides, to prevent this development from getting further out of hand. And we've piloted this in Belgium briefly with a number of individuals, and it was very successful. So we have yet to develop it, and I'd welcome also your input on that and any advice. So yeah. So, but these two examples represent some of the many things that we've come across in the course of the mother schools since 2012, when it started after a workshop in Tajikistan. And they also suggest a possible continuity with the dangers that until recently were not fully addressed. But in a sense, it's not just progress for the mothers and their communities, it also highlights that the access and trust established through mother schools, they alert us, these networks that live on, alert us to shifting dynamics and permit communities to respond to growing threats as they emerge. So this relationship with the note takers, teachers, participants, and local implementing partners, which are always local NGOs who know the individuals in their communities, who know who is affected and concerned. So this relationship, I want to emphasize, is extremely important. Places where we work or have worked. So the mother schools graduates continuously implement their learnings and their newfound confidence in their role as security stakeholders, we find. And in Zanzibar, for instance, they continue to meet on a regular basis, even after 2 years of the program ending. And in a way, the mothers also can be seen as doing the grassroots work of people-to-people messaging. Yeah, and I think a very important point is also, it's about the multiple identities. It's about, I think my slide went away. Okay. It's about the fact that many of the mothers and teachers establish their own NGOs, take on speaking roles and speaking engagements on radio and TV, and negotiate with the community every day and at all levels. So I want to conclude, because I'm conscious of time, by emphasizing how in upgrading the way that the world thinks about parenting, we're employing really crucial weapons, the wrong word, but concepts of tolerance, negotiation, developmental child psychology, and intervention. We're empowering in this process dialogue and inspiring confidence in this local level leadership and action. And moreover, the program returns the understanding to the participants that they have multiple identities as women that go far beyond traditional notions of motherhood. It also encourages them to reclaim those multiple identities that allow for empowered dialogues. So in a sense, in short, the program removes feelings of helplessness, apathy, and defeat, breaks down the prohibitive social constructs, and have led to different forms of everyday normalized violence that pushes vulnerable youth to the margins of society. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me any direct questions, or if you'd like to be in touch, at Rafael, R-A-F-A-E-L, @wwb.org. And as a final note, maybe we've also recently launched a campaign, the Mother's Lead campaign, which is online on our social media handles, which you see here. So please do visit if you get a chance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafael. As you said at the beginning of the intervention, parents are the first teachers for children. So this is the return of empowering them for transferring the good values. So thank you so much for this presentation from the field, and very practical one, which is of most interest. Last but not least, I will give the floor to Harold Wainlock. Dr. Wainlock, the floor is yours for your 15 first minutes intervention. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carola. let me start by a very special thanks to the organization. I've been hopping on the ticket very shortly, and the organization has been very flexible in taking on our offer. With me actually comes a fourth project, the CE PreventNet project, which is a project preventing intolerance and group hatred. This is how we called it, intolerance and group hatred in Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm also happy to take note of Kai's offer actually for next January. There seems to be another webinar series. And with that, I try to make this work. All right. The great value of this initiative, RADPol, is actually that you are also able to, to bind in the RAN and DG Home and the European Commission. Now, I'm going to have a particular issue with a number of things that have been said, but on the side of the Commission. But I think the great value is that we get together on this platform and we are actually able to talk to each other and then share perspectives, which I think is a great initiative. So once again, thanks to the organizers for, it's basically 3 Horizon 2020 that get together, which is really a very valuable, needed thing to do. As to how I plan to organize my little intervention here, is, as you see, the gender prevention and advocacy. These are the 2 issues really. The gender prevention is sort of what we do, and the advocacy is how we talk about it. And it was funny to Raphael just corrected himself on a word that he used. Weapons or measures to moderate very different things happens to us all the time. We speak about frontline practitioners, but really we mean first-line practitioners, or we mean rehabilitation practitioners. So how we talk about it, the advocacy is of key importance. Now, my major takeaways actually from the previous webinars that I had a chance to listen to. It was very interesting from the field, from practitioners. I didn't by no means hear all, but I picked up on Lenka last week, who made it very clear that there's been a shift in her perspective and in research about the problem shifting from issues of nationalism and ethnicity to gender and sexuality. And I'm only going to talk about it briefly because I was aware that many relevant things will be said at the point that I come up, and just point to the womex.org in 2 slides. And a second major takeaway for me personally was actually Jacek Purski, a good colleague from Poland, pointing out that extremism is mainstreaming really, and we have to actually meet the challenges that come with that. One conclusion that I draw from that really is that and I know Jacek agrees with that, the term lone actor is really a very problematic one, because we're really dealing with societal phenomena and more with a mainstream issue than we used to. Extremism as mainstream, sort of a contradiction in terms, but this is how it is. And then this morning, very vividly repeated and underlined, we have to depoliticize. Jacek mentioned it last week. His colleague Anna from the first panel today stressed that these issues, prevention and taking care of our democratic societies, really, they need to be cross-partisan, strictly. Otherwise, we do harm. And if you look around the political sphere, they are not yet there, and we have to work on it. So, depoliticize, get the issue of prevent work out of the party political arena, and then much further harm can be avoided. And from these first 3 takeouts, I take the conclusion to be self-reflective. I think we always have to, once we enter the stage, we always have to be aware that possibly we are part of the problem. And that just naturally happens. So the EU run governments, practitioners, NGOs might be part of a problem. And as I already have have alluded to, I see one problem actually last week, which is a very instructive one. Yeah, we can really learn lessons from that. There's been in one of the webinars, there's been Alexandra, and I'm sure she meant well. I think Alexandra comes from Poland or from Eastern Europe, and on the side of the DG Home of the European Commission, she spoke to the issue of prevention and violent extremism. And in her first slide and first line, we read the sentence, "Jihadist terrorism and extremism is the main threat." Now, and then Alexandra continued to actually speak about lone actors a lot in the context of right-wing extremism, which we just learned that it is very much a milieu problem, a mainstream problem. Now, I picked up on this and just sort of confront you with that. Just think about jihadist terrorism on the one hand, and about Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, is that suitable to? I mean, why is that put together? And as an open question, I come back to this later on, and then good old colleague and friend Stephen Lenos from the RAND, and got entangled in some discussion about a Black Lives Matter movement and how that would be actually extremist and even violent extremist. I mean, the issue is perfectly legitimate. I was just wondering, we're on a webinar on preventing violent extremism, intolerance, group hatred in Central and Eastern Europe, and the Black Lives Matter movement comes up as potentially being a violent extremist. I mean, this is it's a paradox. I just note these phenomena, and I would argue that this is harmful, and I think we have to continue talking to each other much more on these issues, which I regard to be advocacy issues, discourse issues, and issues about how we talk about what we're doing. And in this particular instance, it's actually harmful to Central and Eastern Europe. And let me make that clear. There is one logic to it that's been going on for a couple of years. We've been also writing about it, but on one slide in the Reader's Digest version, the core problem really is that the EU prevent policy, including Iran, as far as Central and Eastern Europe is concerned, has in fact supported extremism instead of preventing it. Now, you might wonder about this crazy guy Harold in Germany, but I really mean it, and I didn't mean to, and I explained to you how that happened in order to make us all understand and avoid it in future times. I mean, first of all, I think as we all are acutely aware of, and it's been said only this morning in the other webinar, within EU prevent policy, extremism, violent extremism has been largely equated with Islamism. Now, this is just how it happened. It wasn't the plan, but it very vividly happened. Yeah, and through that, other forms of extremism, notably right-wing extremism, has been widely underrated. Now, this is problematic enough, but and this has been often spoken about, and I think it's in the process, in a good process of being corrected. But let me leap on one line here. What then happened in terms of Eastern and Central Eastern Europe is that this concept of extremism equals Islamism was then taken east, as it were. It was also propagated in Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, these things, not only do they not match, but damage occurs because, of course, the right-wing extremist forces, movements in Central and Eastern Europe were quite happy that extremism is not a problem for them, but it's Islamism. And they, pick up that line and then say, well, we are fully with you. We are against extremism ourselves. And by the way, our refugees and Roma are potential Islamist terrorists anyhow. Yeah? So you see the logic of what happened actually when the first step was equaling violent extremism with one particular form of it, namely Islamism. So in the end, without anybody's intention, it turned out that the EU prevent policy then in Central and Eastern Europe effectively supported xenophobia, Islamophobia, and right-wing extremism. Now we have to, I would be not honest saying that or not telling you that I'm a bit frustrated about this, because we've been telling the Commission over the last 10 years, basically, they should open up, not single out one extremism, and really pay attention to the region of Europe where we are at. But that's fine. That's life, how it is. We wrap it up and we continue with the key recommendation that we actually have to interact more frequently and more intensely between practitioners and not only academia but policymakers. In particular the ministries of interior, because that's really a lifeline where people need to understand each other quite well. So what we can always offer, I've been offering that for years, is training in advocacy, or what it is, good practice, not in PVE, we know what that is, but good practice in PVE policymaking. What is that? Interagency is certainly one element of it, and finding an equal language, also a common language, is certainly an issue of it. And then certain degrees of political awareness are certainly also an issue. Now this just for you, if you want to read up on this. It's been written since 2017, actually. So have a look, have a read, and please come back to us with suggestions and solutions. Now, from that, which was sort of the preface, given the prior webinars that I watched and needed to respond to, let me just very quickly in two slides refer to our project that Cristina has already thankfully alluded to, the Women, Gender and Extremism and Prevention. A couple of principal observations that have already been, I can do this very quickly. We've come to see over the last couple of years that extremist groups apply gender-specific ideologies, and they also apply pre-modern gender roles, gender stereotypes. It's been very lucidly said already this morning. And young men and women, if you're then into rehabilitation work, you realize that they have very personal gender-specific issues why they join. And a little aside is that girls and women have been for the longest time not really been taken seriously enough. They have not been recognized as being generally politically motivated in the movement, often been mistaken as sort of the girlfriend of the males there, which is not helpful. Then always very worthwhile to underline, and it's already been said this morning, so your men have gender too. There is gender identity issues with masculinity. There's the concept of toxic masculinity. I'm rushing through what has already been said. One thing that has not been said too clearly yet, but was implicit, if you look at the different forms of extremism, and the really relevant one and the violent one, and the engage in group hatred, sexism and homophobia. So once again, Lenker from the start, issues of gender and sexuality is a key part of right-wing extremist, Islamist, and Christian fundamentalist ideology. So they all share that. And I jump to the last line here because as a practitioner working with young people, and this is sort of the upside of it, it's much easier and it's more effective to talk gender and sex with young people because that's what's on their mind anyhow. Instead of trying to make inroads via discussing ideology or religion. So on the upside, having a clear focus on gender issues is quite helpful if you're actually working with young people on the ground. Now from that, I leap, and I will keep that to 3-4 minutes, to something that I want to draw your attention to, the advocacy, finding the right words and the language that makes us successful in linking up to policymakers and academicians and to wider audiences, and linking up to all sectors actually of people in politically speaking, on all sectors of the political spectrum, because we tend to converse a lot with those that are already on our side and forget to actually build the bridges to those that tend to not listen to us too much and we tend to not talk to too much. So that is advocacy, and There is recommendations on it. You find that on the indicated website here. Please be aware, because advocacy, this is the line here, it's not something that some specialists do. We all speak about our meta. Every practitioner speaks about what he or she is doing. So advocacy, we are doing advocacy all the time anyhow. So we need to be concerned about what we are saying, which words we use. And just to give you the gist of the most important recommendations from there, we found that to speak about extremism or terrorism, security all the time, it's not really that helpful. I mean, if you announce to local government what you plan to do with the youth in the village, then you might not even want to use the words democracy, human rights in Europe, because the reaction might not be too favorable. Instead of rather, if you talk about a general agenda of actually helping and safeguarding young people in Central and Eastern Europe, develop their support their personal development and their well-being and skills, and in doing so, working on tomorrow's society. That's a more general, but in a different way also a more precise agenda, because this is actually what we're doing. From there, you could then easily go to also supporting the youth welfare, especially in those countries and regions where there is not much there. And then if you then switch from positive terms into negative terms and preventing and averting something, well, then what we're really doing, and I as a practitioner with youth work, we are preventing numerous risks of young people today at the same time. I mean, there's not only violence and hatred, there's drugs, criminality, there's dependencies, conspiracy theories comes along, a very tricky issue, especially for young people. So there is violent extremism, but not only that, also the other rest of the agenda. And if you tell people that there's nobody going to be disagreeing with you, and that's what we want, because we need all people to be in the boat with that. Speaking, going beyond young people, you speak about families, about the local communities, about one thing that local communities in Central and Eastern Europe are understandably quite concerned about, that the young people are leaving. Yeah, so speak about that. You try to prevent that and create communities that are more supportive of young people, so that they in fact actually stay there and contribute there. From there, we conducted a couple of recommendations, which I'm not going to present in. They're very self-evident actually, but in the interest of time, just let me stick to the last two slides. That in your basic principles, if you have the difficult task to reach out to your local government, which is probably a high degree of right-wing extremism or right-wing populism, so do build strong individual relationships and keep trust with selected individuals, and use informal channels that have been just sort of tricks that have proven very successful over and over again. But please do this in an ethical way, in a transparent way. This is not about stringing, poll stringing or behind the scenes acting, but you can still open up an informal level to people and just strike up a relationship. Another general recommendation is to work bottom up, focus on low middle level officials, because they tend to be closer to citizens' concerns, and that's very helpful for our issues as well. And then once you're more solid on a local level, you might then develop a network among NGOs and initiatives on a community level that give you reciprocal support and make things in life a bit easier in this difficult work. And once this is really stable, go across borders and look into neighboring countries, and whether there is not, as is very easily visible, that the Visegrad states is a solid neighborhood that you can actually address as such. And to close on that, advocacy and dialogue, it's not only a strategy, it's not only a technique, it's really a basic attitude, and frankly, it is quite similar to the basic attitude you need to working with young people. So no, it's all relationship based. You have to be open to do this, willing to do this, strike up a relationship with the person that you would normally probably not engage with. Dialogue with anyone across the political scala. Be honest and respect confidentiality. If you can be on a narrative mode, that means tell experiences rather than arguing things, because that is more effective in the long run if you want to find a common goal. And be self-reflective, admit mistakes, appreciate and learn from others. If things happen in terms of advocacy, if you're speaking about Islamism in Eastern Europe, I think that the trick is to just look at it, be aware, learn from the lesson, and walk on from there. And that would be my my input for the day. And I gladly hand back to Carola.
I think you're muted, Carola. We can't hear you.
Yes, thank you, Cristina. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you, Harald, for your provocative intervention and for underlining the need for opening up the discussion to other forms of extremism and not just equating extremism with Islamism. This is, among others, one of the aim of this conference. So thank you so much. Also for your practical recommendations for practitioners. I agree. Speaking about prevention is speaking about Europe, democracy, cohesion. So of course, let's change also the language for this topic. So I know that we are out of time now, but I think we can still spare a few minutes for questions from the audience. In this sense, I have a question to all of you. So I will raise it as what are the specific security challenge female frontline practitioners face when implementing prevention initiatives? The second part is, are there any toolkits that you would recommend that can be used to train female frontline practitioners on how to deal with this specific safety risk? I don't know whom of you want to open the fire. Maybe Rafael? What are the challenges for female frontline practitioners?
Can I? Yes, that's a very important question. Can I pick up briefly on something that Harold said as well, which I think is really important about the language question, and this goes into challenges as well of frontline practitioners. So when it comes to taxonomy and language, we've seen that it's so important to be dynamic about the language because it can have an extremely isolating effect when you're trying to find the right people for programmatic activities. And that's why it's also so key to be adaptable of the language. I take the example of Macedonia, where initially these hardcore words being used, and we ended up having in the first round 3 people showed up, right? And you're increasingly through this language also isolating individuals because it takes time to also build, and also different words mean different things in different contexts. So I think, and on the second note, obviously, we need to resist weaponizing language because that can also have a negative effect in that regard and on the policy level. Yes, so I think language matters to build trust as well.
We keep on female frontline practitioners and tools or requirements for training.
I can add, unless Cristina wants to jump in, but let me just make one point. I mean, security is key, of course. The security risks are actually sometimes overrated, and they tie into the language business. If you go out saying, I'm offering a service in de-radicalization and exit violent extremism, then you are at risk, principally. Whereas if you're saying, well, you know, we're building skills, skills of dialogue and interaction and tolerance, then you're basically not at risk because that is perceived as being undangerous. So these things actually tie into, but especially if, you know, female practitioners, and we advocate always to do a tandem system, so we always have male, female in our intervention work, which is another thing that, you know, also creates security.
Okay. Let's move forward. Maybe now is the time. It's a question for Cristina. To Cristina, the incel movements could be considered a departure from the aesthetic of the far right and somewhat in contradiction with far right hypermasculinity. Sorry, I will read it again. The incel movement could be considered a departure from the aesthetic of the far right and somewhat in contradiction with right hypermasculinity. So what would be the best way to address it?
That's a very good question, and I think it kind of goes to the point that I was making towards the end, that the incel movement is a thing that we're still beginning to kind of grapple and understand it, especially from a security perspective. So there's a lot that we don't know, but I think the point of it is that really we need to see the incel movement not just as a one sole thing, but rather a community that might have a lot of overlap with the far right, but might also be, you know, it might be dealing with problems of its own. They're also just in case it's interesting, they're also jihadist incels in the community. So people sort of glorifying joining Islamic State because then they might be able to just not stop being incels and then have sex with slaves. So it's a very wide community, and I think the point of addressing it is that it's not only a far right threat, but it's something else, because we have that kind of threat that it's a community that is encouraging and glorifying suicide. So I think part of it is that we need to bring more people in, just not from the security forces that have experience with understanding and dealing with online communities and their behaviors. Of course, when it comes to online communities, it's a bit hard sometimes to pinpoint the exact action, because not everything that is, as we all know, not everything that is said on an online chat is going to translate into actual action. And sometimes it's quite difficult to make those connections and sort of trace it to the offline life. But I think main point of it is not just treat it as a security threat, try to see it as much as it is a complex issue, but if we bring other disciplines in, we can maybe begin to picture a bit more where do they fall as a threat, security to themselves or to other communities.
Thank you. Okay, I will go back to Harald. And why do we need to depoliticize CVE? So if terrorist mobilization is at least in part about political grievances and social cleavage, how would removing politics from the discussion help? Won't people at risk feel that their complaints are minimized, that CVE programs are out of touch with their reality?
Absolutely. Very good question. Thanks for that. It's not the best term, actually, depoliticize. We just haven't found any better one. Let me just repeat what's meant by that strictly, because of course, you know, extremism is an inherently political thing. What I mean by depoliticize is what's been going on as the ping pong game between parties, political parties, that use the issue of extremism for, you know, for partisan reasons. I could write a book about, you know, Germany and how the discussion of, you know, what is the most important or the most threatening form of extremism had played a role there in the public debate and in policymaking. I mean, seriously, could write a book about its generally it's that center and right wing always says, well, the Islamists is the most important and most dangerous, and then center left wing says, well, right wing extremism is the most dangerous, and this goes back and forth, which is why we thought about we really need to come up with principles of good policy making and good programming. And one of the principles is you just don't compare the threat level of major forms of extremism. So very strictly speaking, of course, it's a political issue, but we need to get it out of the partisan political game, because that has only done harm.
Okay, again, sorry. I think that we have time for one more question. So it's again for you, Harald. Can you give an example to understand where the ethical boundary between liaising on an individual level and extreme pooling?
Oh, can you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. Can you give an example to understand where the ethical boundary between liaising on an individual level and extreme pooling?
Oh, I think this refers to, yeah, this refers to the slide on advocacy that again. I mean, just imagine you you are on the ground level in the community, and you are, and I've been telling you, well, in order to be able to begin with your youth work and win the mayor and the security services, you have to talk to them and tell them what you're doing. Now they, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, there may be quite an amount of resistance, because you're perceived as being leftist and being democratic, and if you have a sort of an extremist counterpart, then you're probably perceived as being in a conspiracy of the West against you name it. So therefore, we found out that a more personal level of interaction, an informal level, may be helpful. But that comes very close in sort of doing shadow politics. That pull stringing is the puppets are on your strings, and you're sort of talking to different people, trying to influence them. And this is really an ethical issue. And the difference is, on my slides, you find the next point. Then one way to avoid that is, if let's say you are dealing with the mayor's office, make sure that it's not only one person that you talk to there, but if you can, several, and be very transparent about it, because that takes you away from the suspicion of sort of being a lobbyist influencing illegitimately. But it's a very tricky, a good question. Thanks for that.
Okay, so I think that we have to close now, because it's 12:30, so we are out of time now. Thank you so much again for your most interesting presentations, and also for the final discussion and dialogue. That's great, and this is the why of this kind of webinars, to share, to exchange, and of course share practical recommendation and good practices, because as one speaker mentioned in the first panel of today's session, actors want practical tips for improving the quality of their work, and also for the effectiveness of all the initiatives and practices in this particular and so sensitive field. So thank you so much again for your work, and now it's time to close as well this conference. As the moderator of today's first panel mentioned before, this is just the first step for a series of other conferences will be expected to take place next year, and counting with this and other European projects, because it's always important to share experiences and knowledge between projects. Projects are not working alone. We are a big networks of academics, stakeholder practitioners working in this field, so it's important to exchange our experience, our main findings. So thanks again to the Polish Platform for Homeland Security for its brilliant organization of this series of webinars, also for the challenging situation in which these webinars took place after the COVID crisis, and for the brilliant performance of this online format as well. Hopefully next year we will see face-to-face, but of course I think that this was a very successful starting point for this series of conferences. Thank you so much. All the materials from this conference will be available from the official web page of RADPol conference. So don't be shy to share and to download of this material. Also share the material through your social networks, and of course join and participate in further activities of the 3 projects involved in this series of conferences. So thank you so much and hope to see you soon.